Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here, and we're going to move into our third and final lecture on the reproductive system, and we're going to talk about childbirth and birth control. So this first part, part A, we're just going to focus on childbirth. So thus far, we've talked about basic genetics, how DNA is a long string molecule that forms a code, and certain regions of that code that give information on how to actually make the different parts of a cell and operate as a cell are called genes, right? They code for specific traits. And then DNA is organized into packets called chromosomes. We as humans have 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs. That is called diploid. We get one from each pair from the sperm and one from the oocyte. When we produce gametes, we need to make those halvesy cells, those haploid cells with only 23 chromosomes. So we do the process of meiosis. And in sperm, we end up with 4 haploid sperm from every progenitor cell. But for oogenesis, we're only going to end up with 1 mature oocyte, and then the rest are shed as polar bodies. During fertilization, the sperm uses its acrosomal cap to burrow through the protective layer around the oocyte, and then its nucleus, its 23 chromosomes, fuse with those of the egg. So now we have a new cell called a zygote, which is 2N or diploid and has 46 chromosomes. That's the typical number. That cell then is going to undergo mitosis as it gets wafted by the cilia down the fallopian tubes to the uterus, where it will burrow into that. Once it becomes a ball of cells, it will burrow into the endometrium in a process called implantation, and then differentiate, with some of the cells going on to become placenta and amniotic sac, and others of the cells going on to become the actual embryo. Embryogenesis is that early process where you lay down the basic foundations of all of the organ systems, happens in the first few months, and then later in pregnancy, it is a fetus, right? And it's fetal growth and development, further maturation and growth to get ready for birth. So during that process, again, of fetal development, you need to get all the organs ready and functional because once you are born, you have to do it all on your own, eating, breathing, excreting, all of that, right? You can't rely on the placenta anymore. So just a moment to reflect that birth in humans is different than for many other mammals. So we have 2 features that are relatively unique when you compare us to other mammals. Mammals usually giving birth to live young rather than laying eggs, for one example. So one is that we have these very large brains, and if you have a very large brain, that means you have to have a large skull to put it in. So our heads are relatively large, especially when we are infants, compared to the rest of our body size. Kittens and puppies, their heads are proportionally bigger than the rest of their bodies, but not as much as human babies. We have these big brains, so we have these really big heads. We also have these relatively narrow pelvises because we walk upright rather than quadrupedal or on 4 feet. In order to keep our center of gravity and keep our ambulation or our walking process relatively energy efficient, we have these narrow pelvises. And so we have bigger heads and narrower pelvises. So birth is different than in humans than it is for many other mammals. Our birth process tends to be more difficult. Therefore, we are one of the only animals that tends to give birth in the process of others. If you've ever had a cat give birth, you know they'll go hide somewhere away from everybody else, right? And they'll just do it on their own. Humans, we often need help. Our births tend to be much more difficult because of those big heads and narrow pelvises. Not only does our birth tend to be more difficult, but we also tend to give birth to young that are relatively more immature than other mammals. Now, it varies a lot, but if you've ever seen, a horse or a cow give birth, right, within minutes, the baby is standing and walking, okay? Humans, it takes us like a year after we're born, right? Not 15 minutes. So we're not nearly as neurologically mature as other mammals are, simply because if we stayed in the womb any longer, we wouldn't be able to get out. So we're born relatively immature and relatively helpless compared to lots of other mammals. So we're unique in lots of ways that are not necessarily an advantage here. So childbirth itself in humans has 3 stages. We're going to go through them one by one, but the first is labor. The second is pushing, also called fetal expulsion, right? Getting the baby or the fetus out. And then the third one is the delivery of the placenta or expulsion of the placenta. So our first stage is labor. This is a time of regular uterine contractions. They're intermittent. They usually last 30 to 60 seconds each. This is that smooth muscle in the myometrium, that middle layer of the uterus, contracting and squeezing and pushing down on the baby. And then the fetus's head, right, the skull here, basically is then pressing on the cervix, right, which is that opening from the vagina into the uterus. And the repeated pressing and squeezing and pushing that baby's head down on the cervix will gradually over time cause the cervix to open up and dilate. And so the whole process of labor, the whole point of it is just to get that cervix fully dilated and out of the way, because that is the gatekeeper. A woman cannot push her baby out until her cervix has already opened, and that will happen as a result of stage 1, labor, these regular intermittent uterine contractions. Usually starts off every 10 or 15 minutes, and then they gradually get more frequent, every 5 minutes, then every 3 minutes, and more powerful as they go. Now, what is it that's mediating this system? Well, this is a positive feedback mechanism, and here's how it works. When the uterus starts to contract, right, as I mentioned, it pushes the fetal head down against the cervix. That stretches the cervix. And then nerve fibers, stretch receptors in the cervix are stimulated. Nerve fibers carry that information up to the brain, up to, guess who, the hypothalamus, which then triggers the pituitary gland to make the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin is an interesting hormone for many reasons, but one of the things that it does is causes stronger uterine contractions. You get stronger uterine contractions, more pressure of the baby's head against the cervix, more stretching, more signals to the brain, more production of oxytocin, stronger contractions, and it builds and builds and builds, right? So a positive feedback mechanism, which not a feedback mechanism, whoops. But so as you know, positive feedback mechanisms, we don't use those for maintaining homeostasis, right? We use those when we want to change the status quo, right? We want something big and explosive to happen. So certainly childbirth is one of those things, right? We don't want to maintain homeostasis. We don't want the fetus to stay in the uterus. We want to push it out. So it's going to build and build and build. Very similar to ovulation, right? So that LH and estrogen gets in that positive feedback loop to expand that follicle, get it bigger and bigger until it bursts open for ovulation. Labor is the same thing, positive feedback mechanism. We want a change in the status quo. So the second stage of childbirth is pushing or fetal expulsion. So once the cervix has been fully dilated, now is when the mother can actually push. So she's going to have to bear down, right? Push downward while relaxing her pelvic floor muscles. And she'll usually feel, unless she has an epidural and can't feel it, she'll have a very strong desire to do that. It kind of feels like you really, really, really need to go poop, actually. And the muscles that you're going to use are the same muscles that you would use when trying to have a really big and difficult bowel movement. Same exact muscles. The process of pushing takes anywhere from just a few minutes to sometimes several hours. Usually the first birth someone ever has takes longer, and subsequent births often go more smoothly or more easily, but it varies from person to person. Some people have relatively wider pelvises or relatively smaller fetal heads, and this can be an easier process. Some people it's the opposite, and it can be a more difficult process. Also, sometimes people have trouble getting the hang of pushing, pushing, so that sometimes can be an element as well. So pushing is stage 2 of childbirth. And there's a really good video animation here of what's actually happening with the fetus inside the mom's pelvis during labor and pushing that I'm going to ask you to watch, because I can't produce anything near as good as that. So, and then you'll be able to see that what's happening when you're pushing, so the cervix is out of the way, but now you have to push that fetal head down through the pelvis. Right? And that's a process. That takes time to get it down in there and through the pelvis, through the vagina, and then the baby's head is going to start to stretch the vulva, which then has to stretch widely enough to accommodate the baby's head. So that whole process has got to occur. So the head is usually the largest part of the fetus. It usually has the largest diameter, although sometimes the shoulder girdle can be relatively wide as well. So getting the head out is a really big landmark moment, and then we got to quickly get the shoulders out, make sure they don't get stuck, and then usually the rest of the baby comes out pretty easily. So we can see here a couple of images of people who have just delivered their infants. On the left is a home birth in a tub, and on the right is a hospital birth in a hospital delivery room. So all different types of ways to give birth depending on your situation and your preferences. So the last phase of childbirth after the baby's out, we're still not done actually because the placenta is still inside. So the placenta is embedded in that endometrium, and it's attached to the amniotic sac, and it's still got the umbilical cord. So after the baby is born, the umbilical cord, after a couple minutes, gets clamped and cut because it's still attached to the placenta, which is still inside the uterus. So in a few minutes after the baby has been delivered, the placenta will then detach from the uterine wall. It kind of has this strange Velcro-like attachment. The fetal portion is going to pull away. And then there'll often be a little gush of blood, and then we'll know, okay, the placenta's ready, and the woman can push that out. It's soft, it's mushy, it's much easier to pull out than the baby. And so the placenta in the membranes is also sometimes called the afterbirth. So if you've heard that before, that's what it's referring to. And then after the placenta has been delivered, remember we had those pools of maternal blood? So we had these kind of open blood vessels. And so the uterus is then going to contract down on itself to basically put pressure on itself to stop the bleeding. And so after the placenta comes out, the nurse or the midwife or the physician is going to actually push on the woman's belly and make sure that her uterus is contracting down nice and tightly to kind of seal off and put pressure on that raw spot so that she doesn't bleed too much. That would be a hemorrhage, and it can be fatal. So before we move on to the next slide, I'm just going to show you a couple of images of a placenta. If you are squeamish, then you probably don't want to look. So I wanted to give you this warning. But for those of you who are curious as to what they look like, here it comes. So this is an image of the smooth side of the placenta. This is the side that the fetus would be resting up against. You can see the umbilical cord here attached to the placenta there. So this is the surface that the fetus was against. And here you can see that they've held up the amniotic sac, the membranes, right? So this was the home of the fetus, right? So the fetus was in here. And you can see its umbilical cord now is hanging out. So pretty neat to kind of see. And the rest of the placenta here, let me pick a different color. The rest of the placenta here was embedded in the endometrial lining there. Okay, so those of you who are squeamish, you can open your eyes now. So if everything goes well with childbirth, we end up with a happy, healthy baby and a happy, healthy mom. Aww. Okay, so in summary, childbirth has 3 phases. Labor, which is regular uterine contractions of that myometrium causing gradual dilation of the cervix via a positive feedback mechanism using a stretch of the cervix, sending nerve signals up to the hypothalamus, resulting in the production of oxytocin, which causes stronger uterine contractions. Then there's pushing, which is anywhere from minutes to hours. Usually the head is delivered first, that is more aerodynamic, and and then after the baby is born, the umbilical cord is clamped and cut. And then eventually, third phase, the delivery of the placenta. And we need to make sure that the uterus contracts down really tightly on itself after the placenta is out. And so this is what happens when you have a baby. And so in part B of this lecture, we're going to talk about some strategies to not have a baby. So we're going to start talking about birth control next.